What's up, everybody? Welcome to Fountains of the Great Deep Part 3. Tonight's presentation will be on uniform strata and sorted layers. It's a seminar, 5-part seminar on Earth and space science from the perspective of a global flood. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And check out the other presentations if you haven't seen them. The link is in the top of the comment section if anybody wants to join in. So I'll be with you shortly. Don't go away. Here we go. The origin of strata and sorted fossils. The King James Version of the Bible, it says in Genesis chapter 7, verse 12, the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. It says in verses 17 and 18, the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lift up above the earth, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. So the water prevails from the skies. It's originally coming from those subterranean chambers and then producing 40 days and 40 nights of rain. This is phase 1 of the flood, the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, the rupture phase. You have relatively small pre-flood mountains and seas. It's mostly landmass, the earth, whereas most of the earth today is water. It says God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. The waters returned from off the face of the earth continually. After the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. So 150 days, which means that like 100, you have 40 days and 40 nights of rain and something like 110 days of the water being basically squeezed out from under the earth to where it's no longer spraying into the atmosphere, but it's still, the water level is still rising because the water is still coming up. It's still escaping from under the crust of the earth. And that continues for 110 days. Now, when this stops, when the water stops increasing, when the water flow is restricted, this is called the assuaging event, the abation, to restrain a hostile force down to a minimized intensity. Assuage means to lessen an intense effect. And so it's basically going to eventually reach the equilibrium of, you know, the tides as we see them today. But, when the waters are on top of the mountains and the mountains begin to rise, that water is going to slosh back and forth for a while. So, couple of months, probably. I don't remember exactly how long, but a few months of assuaging until it just reaches the current status of the tides as we see them today. Uh, the waters returned from off the earth continually. After the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. So 40 days and 40 nights of rain, a prevalence of water for another 5 months. It continues to rise up. The waters prevailed or increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. That's after 40 days and 40 nights of rain, and then the water just gets higher and higher for another 5 months. It was lifted up after 40 days, and the rain was ended, and then the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Genesis 7:24, 7:20 says 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. No, it was not talking about Mount Everest. Mount Everest is a post-flood mountain. There are pre-flood mountains and post-flood mountains. We got into that in the last presentation. So water level stops above this point. It stops the if the water level gets above a certain point, like on a geyser, if the whole area were to flood, it would eventually stop the geyser. It wouldn't stop the water from escaping. It would certainly stop it from spraying in the atmosphere. And that's what's happening after the 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Water will continue to fill up a pool long after the nozzle is submerged. Like if you put one in a sprinkler in a pool, it will eventually get to a point where it's filling up the pool, but it's no longer spraying into the air. The rupture phase is 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Then you have a tidal pumping phase of 150 days, more like 110 days though, where the waters continue to rise. And it basically the continents are going up and down, up and down. They're pumping with the tidal movements, of the moon. So the crust moves up and down with the tides. The continental slope will be created. It'll create a bevel effect on the edge of the continents. Water pressure will drop at the initial crack, cause the sides of the crack to buckle down, creating a nozzle. And so it's going to increase water pressure, acting as a nozzle. And then you have water hammers where the water is moving in to where these pillars are connected to the base of the mantle. The entire ceiling of the subterranean chambers are coming down, especially at these points where the rupture happens. Two walls, just collapsing down. And then the water moving in is suddenly decelerated, creating a water hammer. And then that would create massive earthquakes. So the rising and lifting of the nozzle would generate pulses of extreme water pressure as the flow of water hammers the nozzle. This will also increase the water pressure at that particular point. The walls of the rupture collapse and create a natural nozzle effect to basically propel all that water out into space, even. So a lot of it's going to come down, or most of it, but they say that, if you melted all the ice that's on Mars, it would develop into a sea on 40% of the planet, which is like a mile deep. So I believe that all that ice came from the Earth. A significant amount of the Earth's mass and water was launched from it into outer space. But I would say a majority of it came back down to the Earth at the North and South poles in the form of super cold ice, hail, rock, dirt. So you have 150 days. Each time the crust came down, the granite crust at the nozzle would be broken off in massive chunks, as well as the pillars and huge voltages of electricity were released at that time, producing today's radioactive elements. You can go back to part 1 if you want more on that. The water probably continued to rise for about a month after the rain stopped. Once the water level rose high enough to shut off the fountains, the tidal pumping of the crust without flutter would continue to buckle the granite nozzle and squeeze out dirt and water until the mantle began to rise. So what that means is the crust of the earth is fluttering during this time uh, until until the water stops rising. This is what the Earth is going to be doing, moving up and down. The jetting power of the nozzle, especially for the first 40 days and 40 nights, it creates and also combined with the tidal pumping of the moon and the supercritical water, uh, it's a lot of force during those 40 days and 40 nights. It would cause the crust to flap like a flag in the wind. So again, a sprinkler in a pool will eventually stop filling the pool when the water level is high enough to overcome the water pressure of the nozzle. Um, so that will eventually happen, but that would take a lot of pressure. So even dealing with a sprinkler, I would say, well, maybe not a sprinkler, but I guess you get the point. Here we go. Genesis 8:1. God remembered Noah, every living thing, all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. The waters returned from off the earth continually after the end of 150 days. The waters were abated. Psalms 104, 6 and 9. Thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment, the waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys, unto the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound, that they may now pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. Some say that this is like talking about creation. I believe it's talking about the flood. And, the same scenario, though, is happening with the creation and the flood, where, at the creation, the pre-flood mountains are formed by the voice of God. And then at the flood, the post-flood, bigger mountains are formed from the geophysics of that flood. And the same thing is going to happen where the water is going to just find the low places. It's going to rush off of the high places as they rise up into the low basins. Hydroplating phase 1 is about a month, 40 days and 40 nights of rain. And then eventually after that 150 days total, the mantle springs up through the crust of the earth because the overlaying pressure is being relieved. It naturally wants to spring upward, but it can't because the overlaying burden. So if you put two blocks on top of a spring and slowly move them apart, it will eventually spring up and move the blocks apart. The great wind was generated by the sinking of the Pacific floor. The process of stopping the flood and calming the waters took another month. So, as the mid-Atlantic rises, pulls on the Pacific part of the earth, and deflates the Pacific Ocean floor, what we know as it today, and creates the ring of fire at the same time. So this is the same process happening over the course of about, a month. So we talked about that in part 2. The compression event is what we discussed in that presentation, where the mantle rose from between the gap created by the initial crack, the mid-oceanic ridge. It compressed the plates which slid off the mantle, assisted by the subterranean supercritical water and also the natural, melted rock that's going to establish at the base of that sliding continental plate. This was the assuaging period that lasted a few months and tightly sealed the crust into uniform layers of rock, plants, minerals, and bones. This assuaging period here, the water of the earth catastrophically going back and forth, the the mountains rising at the same time. This is what actually forms a majority of the sedimentary layers that we see today. There are sedimentary layers that are very deep, which were formed during that first 150 days. And then there are the ones that were formed at the topmost layers. I would say anything from reptiles to mammals post-flood, assuaging period of the flood. The rising mantle, this is the first month, lifting with the crust, sheared and lubricated the slide of the continents further by pushing up through the gap. This is the hydroplating phase 1. So when this catastrophic rupture of the mantle through the crust, the first phase is that it's going to they're sheared off of their original platform, the granitic base of those continental plates. It creates, with the supercritical, with all of the water under there and all of the magma, it creates a sliding effect. The sides of the gap would buckle downward, erode the granite nozzle upward at a slope as the water was squeezed out. That's why the continental shelves are beveled. An earthquake that shakes the ground sufficiently will cause the rocks and the soil to become more compact. This raises water pressure and creates an upward flow, which muddies the soil at the surface like quicksand, and this is known as the process of liquefaction. Sudden condensing or compacting of rocks forces water out and up to the surface, liquefying the surface, and this causes material on the surface that is heavy to sink, and it will rise. It will come to, what is it called? I can't think of the scientific term for that, but basically the material sinks. So during the flood, during the first 150 days, and then also the assuaging period, the water, the tides, which during the flood are going to be like average 150 feet, 200 feet tidal waves, and they're going to be consistently flowing across the entire globe. And when a tide comes in, it will compress the soil. When it moves out, it will loosen it, allowing lenses of, plants and animals and just water itself to establish. And then they are compressed again. And so lifting and compressing the soil. And at the same time, you got to think, the 150 days you have all of this rock and stuff that's being released from under the crust of the earth, like the sides of that giant wall where the rupture is, it's eroding and it's just releasing all of this dirt and mud, basically recycling the earth. And so all of this strata is just piling up, all this different material, plants, animals, dirt, rock. It's piling up and piling up as these massive tidal waves move in and out. And so that establishes the geologic layers. If you put various plants and minerals in a giant tub and water in the other one, you put them on like a teeter-totter mechanism, and then you put a cylinder or a pipe that connects the two. You just move the water in and up through the various plants and minerals, and it will establish them into layers after many repeated cycles. And so on a global scale, this would easily sort the layers of the earth into layers, into sorted layers as time progresses, as the water continues to rise and the sediments continue to rise. Now, at the hydroplating phase, okay, when the mountains are starting to rise, that mantle is rising up through the crust during this phase about a month, and the water is going back and forth even more catastrophically because the mountains are forming, so way bigger tides, So as this is happening, as the crust is rising and it's buckling and folding, compressing, just like pushing a rug up against a wall, well, all that dirt and stuff that's rising at the same time is being scoured off. And so a lot of it, what we see today, the mountains, is just the remnant of, a scouring process. There was many tons of sediment, it's just been shuffled up, missing, like where you stand, where I am in Oklahoma. The surface of Oklahoma is like Pennsylvanian or Permian rock, and that's where you find the insects, the carbon, and so that's very low on the geologic column. And so that means that, once in this area, there used to be just, miles of rock, which is now gone, okay, because we're standing on the Permian. So if you understand what I'm saying, there, at the time of this assuaging period, a massive amount of that earth was just moved from one location and redeposited into another. Now, during this process, you also have, melted rock coming up through these layers that are establishing, and all the melted rock, that was accumulated during that compression event is trapped in these chambers. It's called magma. When it comes to the surface, it's called lava. And you can get solid rock, a lot of, like a mountain, they can actually press down on the liquid magma and cause a plateau to rise. Coal is formed in basic stages, dead plants and material accumulated in swamps. That develops into a layer of peat, and that's compressed by heat and pressure, the overlaying sediment. So basically, a tropical forest gets rapidly buried by mud and dirt, and then it squeezes it because the pressure, the heat that it produces, and it over time it turns it into coal. Not millions of years, but it can happen rapidly, in relative terms. So over the course of maybe 1,000 years, coal can form just by being under that much heat and pressure. And then also during the compression event, that heat and pressure that's at those low layers, it will be increased. It's going to be intensified, not only because of the movement of the continent, but because of the heat that's being produced, at the mantle, the rising and lifting, and the electricity, and just the heat in general, because of the pillars, and all of the movement down there. But let's move on. Understanding coal formation is pretty basic. Coal formation and lensing. Intertwined plants uprooted and transported by enormous waves are buried by sediment. Liquefaction of the sediments during wave action gave these massive vegetation buoyancy. So they become their own layer, and then gets buried by other sediment. Footprint fossils left from animals fleeing chaotic flooding were quickly buried by sediment as they sunk through liquefied soil. So the basic principle of liquefaction happening here, where the animal pressing down onto the soil compacts it, making it heavier, and it will sink through lighter sediment, and be preserved in lower layers. The imprints left by the organisms were quickly covered by sediment. The sediment dried and hardened before the imprints could be erased by water or wind. The sediment was then buried under more sediment, became compacted, and cemented together to form rock, and this process is much the same as the formation of body fossils, according to AmericanGeoscience.org. Footprints would compact the soil and make it heavier. The cause of the soil around the footprint to rise with water, and the compact sediment will sink. So it's pretty easy, heavy material falls through lighter material. During the flood, global tsunami waves would hammer the crust. So during this, flooder phase, massive amounts of water just being surged up through all these channels and stuff that exist in the pre-flood crust that were cut by the supercritical water developing, for the first 1,600 years before the flood. So the water's already supercritical. It's already been eating at the ceiling and at the chamber floor, because all the water is under the crust of the earth and it's supercritical. That's going to dissolve minerals in the subterranean chamber ceilings and the floors, and this creates different channels and stuff and cracks in the rock, which at the time of the flood, the up and down flooder phase, the water is just surging through the crust of the earth. There's massive earthquakes, huge, shifting is going on with all of the dirt and the rock during the flood. So when that hammering process occurs, when the granite nozzle comes down and all that water suddenly decelerates, like we talked about on the previous slide, this increases, that jolt of high pressure from under the crust, and it rises actually up. And so not only do you have upward pressure in the crust coming from below, but also from above because of the waves, and these will together help to establish the layers. So a closing valve, a granite nozzle, colliding waves, crushing pillars, rising mid-Atlantic ridge, the compression event. These are the mechanisms to sorting the fossils, establishing them into uniform layers. Let me check in the comment section real quick. Doesn't look like anybody's been talking any trash in there, so we'll go back to the slides. Let me get a drink of water. Fossil sorting. So the story is, the single-celled organisms at the bottom developed into the trilobite that you see there at the first layer on the bottom, and that evolved into like the insects, and that evolved into some basic fish, and then you had, or I guess it's you got, organisms live on the ocean floor that develop into organisms that live close to the shore, like insects, and then they developed into more land-dwelling creatures like reptiles, which then developed into, they evolved into the mammals. And so they're in that order. If you look at the fossil record, you look at multiple places in the earth, there is a complete geologic column. If you're just looking at the fossils, they're in the right order. Now, they may not all be present in most cases, but you can tell just by the consistency of what certain geologic layers are made of and certain index fossils that they contain. You find them in certain areas, we know that that's the order that they were buried in. So the conclusion, the conventional wisdom is that these evolved in that order. But the biblical wisdom is that they lived in that order. So what do I mean by that? Well, they were buried in that. If you look at the earth today, the same animals with the same kind of body plans as the trilobite, index fossil, and all the other fossils, that represent that geologic period right there that are found in that layer of strata. Similar animals exist today. They live on the ocean floor, and the complexity of organisms in the order that's presented in the fossil record on the geologic timescale, it matches what the organisms that are alive on the earth today. The more simple organisms are on the bottom, even though they're insanely complex, just relatively speaking, even though they are unimaginably complex. The single cells that are on the bottom of the ocean floor are actually deep in the ocean floor soil, hundreds of feet below the ocean floor in the dirt. There are these little single-celled organisms. They would be considered primitive, but that's just relatively speaking, not that they're actually primitive because they're highly complex, but rather they're compared to a mammal, a single cell is less complex. So the less complex creatures, they live on the ocean floor, like today, okay? And then you have animals that live in the ocean, like the fish, and then you have animals that actually live near the coastlines, like the amphibians, and then you have, the list goes on. You have the reptiles on higher land, and then mammals. So that's the order that they were living in. Yeah, their ecological zonation. They were buried based on where they lived. They're basically the complexity of organisms will increase with a rise in the altitude above sea level. So each time the fluttering crust rose above the muddy floodwaters. If you want more on that, you can actually go to a beta seminar that I did on transition. I debated transitional fossils with Snake Was Right, so that's in the debate playlist. And then also there's a presentation of it in the beta seminars. So you can check those out. That's highly recommended. Let's move on. Each time the fluttering crust rose above the muddy floodwaters, it had in evolutionary terms thousands of years worth of additional layered sediments containing sorted dead things trapped in liquefaction lenses. This first phase of the flood, the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, the flood movement, just establishing hundreds of layers. And then you have the compression event, which is a month after the waters are right. It's over 150 days Um, the end of the flood is like a month. This assuaging event, the compression event, which is the formation of the modern mountains, this will further sort the utmost layers, the top layers, into detailed, uniform strata. The mechanism for sorting bones and other materials of rock and dirt into uniform layers. Phases of exposed shoreline. So just because the whole earth is flooded, you know, in one area, that doesn't necessarily mean it's flooded in another area, because the water, especially during that 1 month, the end of the flood, the assuaging period, but then also during the first 40 days and 40 nights. And then after the 40 days and 40 nights, you could still have exposed, for a temporary amount of time, like exposed layers of earth. And this is, we have evidence that the dinosaurs were in that scenario where the water was rising, where the tides would come in and flood the area, and then would they go back out, leave some living, dinosaurs that didn't get drowned remaining on the surface, and they would continue to try to uh, run to higher grounds. And they left their footprints behind, left their fossils behind, just graveyards of fossils buried in water, in sediment that was, sediment is dirt and rock that was deposited by water. So billions of dead things were laid down in rock that was deposited by water. Sounds like a pretty good case for a flood. But the first phase is that you have this back and forth motion, this gigantic, consistent, and repetitive assuaging of the waters during the whole flood, really. But then you have the massive tidal waves, the fluttering crust, and the water hammering. The fossils were settled into layers during the 40 days. Another 150 days brought more sediments, which compacted those layers. And then the final calming lasted 30 to 40 days, caused the Earth's crust to compress, and that's the assuaging period, or compression event. But it's having a dramatic effect on the dirt and the rock itself as it accumulates, and that is, the formation of uniform layers and sorted fossils according to the global flood model. The order of burial would be sea life, covered in the entire pre-flood vegetation supply. That would be like what is above the sea life, because the sea life is going to go first because it's on the bottom. So the dirt and the rock, the water is going to start eroding the pre-flood mountains during that first 40 days and 40 nights. It's bringing all of that dirt and rock down into the low basins, and it's covering the earth in this sediment, establishing it into layers progressively. And it starts at the lowest places. So that would be where the sea life is. That's why we find the fossils in the order that they are in. So the mobile animals, like the dinosaurs, are trapped and they're drowned in mud. They're trying to escape to higher ground. Each region had its own mix of animals and plants once they were buried in sediments. Liquefaction provided additional sorting by such characteristics as density and shape. You have the North and the South Poles that are blasted with muddy ice, and they have prehistoric giant fossils found in the utmost layers, like the saber-toothed tiger and the woolly mammoth and the hairy rhinoceros, and other examples like giant sloths and giant beavers that are found in these regions. Those are those are pre-flood mammals that live on the highest points. So the development of this shale and the limestone and the coal, it was all deposited from a global flood. It doesn't represent time periods, it represents phases of a flood that lasted approximately a year in three basic phases. The rupture phase, the flutter phase, 150 day. I guess the flutter phases. Well, maybe two phases. Okay. Um, Well, I have a term for the second phase. But phase one, the rupture. Phase two is at 110, where the water continues to increase. And then phase three is the compression event, the formation of the mountains. It's three basic phases can explain all of this. History of paleontology tells us early geologists, they noticed that similar fossils were often in two closely spaced horizontal layers. They're almost always found in a graveyard, and that's been the observation ever since. That when you find fossils, that they're always in a mass graveyard. So, the question of why they're in that order can be explained. The question of how the geologic layers, were established is just basic principles of the lighter particles um, rising up through the heavier or more dense, whatever it is, density and weight acting together to basically shift the crust of the earth in water. You can look at a principle of jigging, they use in the oil industries and stuff. Particles or of rock and dirt, whatever, they're fed into a pool of water to be uplifted by gravity from pulsating water. After each pulse, the particles are suspended and fall to the ground to be sorted according to density. So this is what it looks like. You take a piston, you force the water down, and then it comes up to the other side of this chamber and forces water up through those minerals. And so based on their weight and their density, they will establish themselves into layers. The heavier or denser material at the top will fall through the lighter and less dense particles at the bottom. They will rise to the surface. That's why you look on the earth and there's a lot of soil on the top, because it's the lightest of all the dirt and the rock that is underneath it. Cyclothems occur where there is a repeated sequence of sedimentary rocks. Water lenses could capture fragile bodies like jellyfish. Even the downward movement of the waves gently compress the sediment around the lens. And so this is really the only way that you can explain a graveyard of fossil jellyfish. I mean, it has to be buried rapid, it has to be buried deep, and it has to be established into this sort of a lens, where it's kind of suspended. Because, it's been established into a layer in between two other layers perfectly. And because there's so much jellyfish and there's so much water, it kind of protects them. And if you have another scenario where it's just a bunch of dirt slowly accumulating on top of it, it has to be very, not only rapidly, but it has to be deep enough to preserve the jellyfish to that great of a detail, because these things are very exquisite that we've been able to study. Paleontology in this field of research, fragile animals like jellyfish being fossilized, you have to bury it deeply. It has to be a very special circumstance, and it's the circumstance that a global flood would provide. Catastrophic hydrologic sorting and basic principles of liquefaction. The rising and falling of the waves would compress the layers, collapse the water lenses. The upward flow of water suspended the particles and settled them into layers according to density. Other things. Cementing the liquefied crust. A very large amount of water was involved in a global flood, and the source of the silica would be quartz that's dissolved in extremely hot subterranean supercritical water containing about 20% quartz. By volume, that's what granite is. Has a lot of quartz. And, there's a way to chemically form limestone. And then there's another way to organically form limestone. So both of those together formed a lot of the cementing agents. But then the silica, this just formed from just the granite rock itself being eroded by supercritical water over the many centuries before the flood happened, because the flood is a result of all the water that was under the crust of the earth before the flood. being heated to a super high temperature so that it could escape. So God basically set up a ticking time bomb, probably, somewhere like around the time when Adam sinned, you know, this natural tidal pumping of the earth, you know, with the moon, because the moon is pulling on the water, it's also pulling on the earth. And this is going to basically slowly heat up the water, that subterranean water, and it will become very hot by the time that a rupture happens in the crust, allowing all that water to escape. But during all of that time, it's actually creating a massive amount of dissolved particles, such as silica and limestone. They will be swept up by those fountains, redeposited onto the earth as the strata accumulates, and that will cement the strata. So that concludes this presentation. Well, one more thing, I guess. Minerals trapped into water lenses and sorted according to buoyancy were dissolved by supercritical water into cementing agents such as silica and compacted by incredible wave action and gravity. And that's a more complicated way of saying what I already said. You have minerals that are just trapped into these lenses, because the water deposit, you have water lenses that are filled with different minerals, and they're filled with different, even animals and stuff, different ecosystems. Let me get rid of the slides here. Oh, Iger's in the chat says, "Sorry, not going to be able to make it." That's all right, brother. I got it. But it'd be great to have you here. You can come back next week, or anytime I go live. You're more than welcome. That's the co-host Iger TV. So shout out Iger. Go to his channel, like, share, and subscribe, and then also do that with this one here. But you have different kinds of ecosystems existing at the flood. All those are rapidly buried. The sediment, is accumulating as all of this is happening. Same thing at the last month of the flood. The sediment, is building up into this big mound, but at the same time it's all building up, it's all being swept out and deposited into other areas. And so again, establishing layers. And so there's two ways to look at geology. This is the paradigm shifter here. You can just keep looking at geology from the perspective of conventional wisdom, what is taught in the mainstream, the science journals and National Geographic and the universities, which says that, you have to look at the Earth's formation from the perspective of uniformitarianism. The principle that the way things are happening now is the way they've always been happening. Long, slow, gradual processes have created the canyons and the layers of rock themselves. You have to shift from that. You have to come outside of the box, Pandora's box. You have to just be critical. You have to critically analyze the situation. Now, if you do that, there are other ways to explain why the layers are uniform and why the fossils are sorted. There's not just one explanation. They are, in fact, because evolution is a carefully protected state religion. They are using tax money, tax dollars, to compete against an alternative explanation. They know that the global flood is the one that was taught before they came in and tried to take over the school system. So they're just retaining their power, okay? The conventional wisdom on geology is just a market, has nothing to do with the truth, has to do with a very stupid and dangerous religion called evolution. But thank you so much for tuning in. Stay in prayer. God bless America. My name is Christopher Sylvius. Peace be upon you. I'm out.